4 questions and
Janetta,
Yeah.
could you address the revised shortfall numbers that Keene put out shortly after the budget came out when he came up with the $7.7 billion figure? Those unemployment compensation numbers that you were referring to, for instance, were factored into that.
Yeah, absolutely. So there is a different question. How do you solve the $8 billion hole versus was there ever an $8 billion hole? As you'll see, and I think in a document that we all are pretty familiar with that was used in a press briefing for many of you, you'll see outlined how we solved the $8 billion hole. But there is not an acknowledgement that some of those same sources were actually used against the previous administration in the previous budget to calculate the $8 billion hole. So if you are assuming you get to an $8 billion hole because you have 0 monies available to you in debt restructuring, 0. So you have to go find that money. But then at the end of the day, you say, oh, no, we're going to do that again. Well, that reduces that $8 billion hole by that same amount of money. So he can call it in this document, how he closed it. But that's not the question that we're answering. Apples to apples, 2009 versus 2011, what was the hole?
But isn't the apples to apples really what Kasich presented instead of what Mary Taylor and Tim Keene presented?
So an $8 billion hole was constructed in 2009. Assumptions changed by $3 billion. If there was another $8 billion hole somewhere in the 2012 and 13 budget that they then constructed later, then that was never laid out for us. So the apples to apples is $8 billion, it changed by $3 billion. I think we can all agree on that. And this is all very clear. We're using OBM and LSC documents. But then if they contend that there's still a $7.7 or $8 billion hole, what's the construction of that? Did they conveniently find a second $8 billion hole? Because that would be a huge coincidence if they did. Or instead, and I think this is a fair question, did they back into solving an $8 billion hole?
Is this mostly, though, a symbolic, theoretical thing you're talking about? Oh, we'll stop scaring Ohio into things are so. You're not really, or does it go beyond that? You're not claiming we've got $3 billion extra floating around, right? Or are you? I don't think you're saying that.
Well, I think that we should put the question to the Kasich administration of where that $3 billion went. They did the spreadsheet. They showed that we had $7.7 billion in savings to make up the hole. The hole is only $5 billion. Where did those other resources go? I think that's a very fair question.
But the fact that your allies in this fight are saying that when they want more money for their projects, they've been saying we need more revenue, drop this tax break or raise this tax. Doesn't that show that even they believe that we're at 0 right now and they want more revenue? They're not just saying, oh, there's extra revenue. You just found $3 billion extra revenue. They're saying, no, we do need extra revenue. We'll need to either raise taxes or drop some tax loopholes. Doesn't that show what you're saying is really mostly just symbolic?
I can't speak for those other organizations who are asking for the tax increase, but I can tell you that this is not symbolic because in 2009, very detailed spreadsheets with assumptions were released. So it's not symbolic this changed. When you compare spreadsheets to spreadsheets, the number changed by $3 billion.
Just kind of follow up on that. I mean, but I think what we're trying to say is, no matter whether you call it $8 billion, $5 billion, or $3.50, we're still where we are with the budget, and there's no new money to pay for new, to ease the cuts, to pay for other programs. So in the end, regardless of what you call it, what are you getting by calling it something different?
Sure. Well, today, and this is why I started out my comments, today, in the context of our policymakers deciding how to balance the budget, today is about honesty, and it's about putting an accurate number on the projected hole. You make policy in a context, knowing all of your numbers. An $8 billion hole is very different than a $5 billion hole. The tools that you may use to fill an $8 billion or $5 billion hole may be different. To even up until this day, to use an $8 billion hole to justify the policy conversation and the hard decisions that are being made is problematic. They can't make that case anymore. Do we acknowledge there's a $5 billion hole and there are many sacrifices that need to be made? Absolutely. Absolutely. This doesn't change that fact. And that's not what we're here to talk about today. We are talking about trying to nail down the correct number, looking at the data and the assumptions.
Let me just make one comment. Let me just add something to that. I think what Janetta is saying, and I want to make this very clear, the questions that have been raised are in an economic context. But there's a political context, too, for this entire budget. And remember, the Kasich administration and the governor himself continue to this very day telling Ohioans publicly that there's an $8 billion hole that and that's why we have to cut schools by $3 billion. That's why we have to cut local governments by 50%. That's why Senate Bill 5 is necessary. So there is a political context. Now, as Janetta pointed out, if the governor wants to make a political argument for his agenda, he's welcome to do so. But he can no longer use an economic argument to do it. And I think that's the point we're making.
You're raising the question of motive, and I guess my question would be, the person that's making that decision still has a hard job. So there are going to be a lot of winners and losers, whether it's $8 billion or $5 billion. So what would you propose the winners and losers be? If you have to make that decision, then who makes the sacrifices and who doesn't?
Well, that's something that's certainly being debated, but this press conference was to focus on the beginning point. How much money is
referred to the
available.
extremist policy agenda, and you're saying this is politicized, and you're raising the question
Sure.
of motive. So what I'm saying, if you're going to raise the question of motive, you're going to take this out of the strictly numerical realm, then what part of his agenda is most extreme, and what do you think needs to change?
I would use Senate Bill 5 as an example. The $8 billion was used to justify Senate Bill 5 and closing the budget hole. Senate Bill 5, I believe, is an example of an extreme policy agenda. We do not have to take away the rights of these workers to fill the $8 billion hole, and that's a disingenuous argument to imply that.
So if today's presentation is about the research that you've done, and as you just said, it's about honesty and accuracy, and the flip side of that is dishonesty and inaccurate, are you accusing the governor of being a serial liar?
No, we're not standing here today saying the governor is a serial liar. What I am asking, and what Innovation Ohio is asking, is that they acknowledge that there is no longer, based on their own assumptions, an $8 billion hole, and they stop using that $8 billion figure to justify their policy decisions. That's all that we're saying.
Janetta, I'll give you points 1 and 2.
Mm-hmm.
On point 3, though, on one-time money, they made an assumption that certain one-time money would be gone.
Mm-hmm.
It is. Now they're putting in different one-time money to fill either the $5 billion or the $8 billion.
Sure.
But let's say it's well, I would say you have justified here, what, minus the 783, that would be the whole.
Yeah.
Why are you adding back in the 783? Because that's new. It's not policy changes, but it's new to this budget.
Yep. That's a good question. And to get to the 783, we wanted to be very careful about that. To get to the 783, we only included 3 things, 3 changes. Debt restructuring, because in that assumption, back in 2009, debt restructuring is not assumed. Therefore, they put that money toward the hole. So we're saying apples to apples, don't charge it against the hole, let's just keep it the same. Okay? So take that away from that. That was over $400 million. That was penalized against us. Actually, it was penalized. I think it was almost $800 million. But the fact that you fill that with $400 million, then we'll give them credit that the whole debt restructuring hole wasn't filled, but $400 million of it was. So you can't penalize that and count that toward an $8 billion hole. The second thing was the debt baseline, and that was a smaller amount, I think $30 million, but in that same category of debt restructuring. And then the third was federal one-time money. And we know that federal one-time money was used to construct the budget, or the $8 billion deficit. So the fact that they used that and didn't acknowledge that, and in fact penalized the previous administration in the 10 and 11 budget and said that that federal one-time money is not going to continue, actually $303 million of federal one-time money is available to us, and therefore you can't count that against the $8 billion hole.
But you know, the $303 million at the time, they didn't know that that would be available. And the 440 debt restructuring, that was a policy change. That wasn't just something they knew was going to happen. They had to actually do that and take a vote on it and make it happen. So they're basically saying we help fill the hole by these two. One, an assumption that the Fed would do something, and another with a policy change. So I guess I'm not understanding why that shouldn't count as helping to fill the $8 billion.
I mean, that sounds, what he's talking about, I think, sounds like part of the solution, not part of the whole.
Right, which
Okay,
is mine.
sure.
Yeah.
Which is, yeah. So that's what these were in 2009. These were assumptions, okay? They were spreadsheets with very detailed numbers plugged into it. They were projections, okay? The projection for that, for their assumption to build the $8 billion hole, the projection on debt restructuring changed significantly. And I point out debt restructuring and federal one-time money, again, we took a very conservative view because there were other one-time monies in there, like, for example, unclaimed fund transfers. You know, that's something that, okay, that happens all of the time. I'm not going to pick a fight with that one-time money. Things like rotary rates. Those are in there too. They use that to solve the budget. That's fine. But it is those very factors that were used to construct the $8 billion hole that we're taking issue with. And it's only the three of them that we believe fall into that category, where you have to acknowledge that money was available to you that was different than that same line in 2009. And that's all we're saying. Acknowledge that. They can say that that's what they did and it helped close the hole. I think that's a little bit disingenuous, but that's what they did. But what we are saying is that if you really were honest about the 2009 numbers and revising those, we're asking for a revision of assumptions, you would revise that because that was one assumption that didn't hold true.
Why wouldn't LSC have numbers similar to yours? I believe
I
theirs are
don't
pretty
know
similar
who-
to
They
did
had
that
one-time
actually?
money that came up to
Right.
$8 billion.
Yeah, they had one-time money, but I'm not sure anyone has done the exercise of looking back at the very detailed assumptions that were in the 2009 Taylor-Keene analysis. And that's where I feel like maybe we've gotten lost a little bit. We've been asking for the administration, show us an $8 billion hole, try to construct it, but we have to go back and look at the assumptions and where the $8 billion hole came from in the first place. And this was in 2009. And granted, in 2009, you're not going to make a prediction and everything stick. That just doesn't happen. So the question was not, were their projections right on? The question is, to what extent did they change and how? And that's what we are asking. To what extent did those 2009 projections change and how? And I feel like to not acknowledge all of those assumptions that were very convincing during that time, and then to still use the $8 billion and never go back and question that, actually allows for really the question to never be answered. And I think that that's what we're all struggling with in this budget is they're answering, this is how we solve the $7.7 billion hole, but never revisiting what does it look like now. Maybe there is a new hole, but they're going to have to show how $3 billion of assumptions changed to get, coincidentally, a new $8 billion hole.
Janetta, is part of the problem here that the fact that we've had to rely on Mary Taylor and John Kasich for these numbers? Why didn't Governor Strickland or Perry Savity give us a figure before they left? It was their watch.
So the projections that were done in 2009 depended on some of those same numbers that OBM has. And that's why we're not taking issue with, at one time, maybe this $8 billion hole was projected. all of those numbers were out there for everyone to see. It was what has changed in the last 2 years that we are really trying to get at.
But we, as reporters, repeatedly asked the Strickland administration to put a number on it itself, and it refused. Isn't that part of the problem? Would we be having this discussion now if the Strickland administration had done this before leaving office?
I think that it would probably be unprecedented for an administration to solve a budget hole a year before they had to put forth a budget. That doesn't happen. We got this projection 2 years out, which is very unusual, but for whatever reason, Mary Taylor and Tim Keene decided to put a number out there. That was a projection. Turned out to be a very wrong projection. So there is a reason that we take all of the information at the time when a governor has to introduce the budget and make those decisions based on those assumptions, those forecasts, all of this stuff that is dynamic. At any part along the last 2 years, you could have stopped and taken a snapshot. Okay, what is it now? What is it now? What is it now? But that doesn't really help solve, ultimately, at the end of the day, what you have to deal with. And that is the latest projections that a governor has available before the constitutional responsibility that he has to introduce the budget. That's where the conversation needs to take place. That's where the conversation has always taken place. But with the interjection of a projected budget deficit in 2009, 2 years before the 12-13 budget was even introduced, it changed the nature of the conversation.
Just to be clear again, I understand your point about, especially on collective bargaining, that this by saying it's 8 instead of 5, creates an atmosphere, oh, we need to do more than maybe you think we need to do. But the amount of savings there is kind of murky, so I get your general thrust.
Sure.
But are you saying, but I want to make sure, you're not saying, though, that if we accept $5 billion instead of $8 billion, then automatically now the cuts to education don't need to be what they are now. They can be half that much. And the cuts to mental health, they don't need to be as big. You're not saying that. You're just saying,
I would
let's cut
certainly
5
like to
instead
see
of
those
8.
cuts to education reduced and the cuts to local governments reduced. But I think we have a transparency issue too, and it's not a question for me to answer. The question is, so then, if you solved a $7.7 billion problem, got $7.7 billion in savings and increased revenue and other one-time sources, and the whole is only $5 billion, where did the rest of those dollars go? And I think that's a question that we should all continue to ask. I think that there is an issue around transparency, and again, the administration being forthcoming, because I don't think anybody has gotten a straight answer from the administration, and I think that's why we see legislators and others who are still struggling with some of the basic math in the budget, including how can you increase spending by cutting $7.7 billion.